you are the head of SAIA's Governance of Africa's Resources Program. Could you tell us how you see the extractive governance landscape changing on the continent?
Our extractive governance work is right now at the center of a major policy transformation going on in Africa in terms of the development discourse on the continent. I think the context of this Africa Rising, Africa's economic resurgence, certainly coupled with the extractive boom we've seen over the last decade, is creating a lot of optimism about the potential for rapid and extensive human capital transformation on the continent. I think at the same time, there's been some concern about the lack of a transformative trickle down from this growth story, certainly in terms of citizens not feeling the benefit of the recent growth. When you put that against the broader background of the so-called youth bulge in Africa, I think there are serious concerns here. At the same time, I think we're going to be pressed to engage with some of the questions we're not traditionally used to addressing as such within the ambit of our work. How do we use resource governance ideas and innovations to help address some of the structural fragilities that continue to be a source of concern for many policymakers looking at Africa's reality today.
What are some of the major policy questions that need to be addressed in this area?
Some of the guides to that one can already find, listening very closely to the rhetoric and the focus of many of the policy discussions and processes that are now ongoing. To take it from the top, the African Union Commission led by Madame Lamine Zuma has talked a lot about the need for African self-reliance. I think a lot of what she was saying in this respect relates to the need better to tap into Africa's human and material resources, extractive resources being a very important part of that. The African Economic Outlook report done by the UNDP, UNECA, OECD, and a host of very important institutions thinking about Africa's economic transformation. Also, not a coincidence, choosing natural resources as a key theme. And the Kofi Annan led Africa Progress Panel has also followed this line of thinking. I think some of these key questions we would have to address in the coming years and perhaps for the next few decades, the broader macro policy framework. How do we help African policymakers to design policy and institutional framework that address the question of redistribution, but also creating social safety nets, using extractive resources to develop a viable skill base as a way of transforming Africa's human capital.
On a global level, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or the EITI, is an attempt to set guidelines for extractive industries such as oil, mining, and so on. The fact that South Africa is not a signatory to this initiative, is that cause for alarm?
I think what we need to focus on going forward is to actually make the case on the specific benefit that South Africa will stand to derive from being a member of this initiative. And I think that argument can be made on a number of levels. First, in a number of the jurisdictions in Africa where the EITI applies, certainly this contributes to a greater transparency in the extractive sector. And I think this is a good thing for South African businesses that operate right across the continent as a whole. Two, I don't think it's a coincidence that some of the northern countries that initially refused to join the EITI, including the United Kingdom, France, I think Canada as well, and the United States, the fact that they're now engaging with the framework it seems they would formally accede to membership of the ITI. I think this is an example South Africa could follow, because from the South African perspective, part of the reason for not joining the ITI initially is that it seemed to have been a club for some of the poorer southern countries that were not so geostrategically important in the international system. One can make the case that if South African policymakers sit down to reflect critically about what the EIT itself now represents today, it is potentially an avenue for South Africa to also project its geopolitical influence in the African context. I think it's a viable platform and potentially for lesson sharing between South Africa and some of its African peers. Pretoria often make the case that the extractive regulatory framework here in South Africa is sufficient to ensure proper transparency and all of that in the South African extractive sector. There are ways in which South Africa's membership of the ITI will now allow the country to upload some of these domestic best practices into the ITI framework. I think it's something policymakers should reflect on very carefully.
Ola, thank you for talking to us.